Welcome to this episode of the Essential Church Podcast, an ongoing conversation about some of the most important issues facing the local church today. I'm your host, Andrew Arndt, and today I want to take you to the second part of the interview that we conducted with Scot McKnight and Barringer on their book, A Church Called Tov. Last week, we spent some time talking with them about how to diagnose toxic church cultures and how church cultures become toxic. This week, we want to pick up the conversation and talk with them a little bit more about how we form goodness cultures that heal people and make them whole. As always, we think you're going to be helped by the conversation. And without further commentary from me, here's to the interview.
I don't know if young leaders will even pay attention to this podcast, especially young and talented ones. But if they are, by chance, listening right now, Scot and Laura, what advice would you give a 20 or 30-something leader who is dynamic? They do have preaching chops. They have maybe educational degrees on and they're good at what they do. They have charisma and charm on the stage. How can they avoid these traps? How can they avoid falling into the same old traps that we've seen over the last 30 years?
Well, this Brady is sort of my quest right now. A student who is one of these young pastor types, he's got what you call preaching chops. He really does. And he's got charisma, and he planted a church and it's flourishing, and they've hired a couple more pastors and it's growing. And he comes to me and he says, what can I do now so that I don't become one of those pastors later? Yeah. And he said to me, I could be the next one. Uh-huh. And he really believes that he could become a mega church pastor star. And maybe he can. He's pretty good. And so I've been thinking about this. And really, this is what the Tove book is about. The first thing I would say is, let's just put it this way. I think that every pastor, one of their most important thing is to become self-aware through a really good battery of psychological tests that the therapist can say to that person, you have strong traits of narcissism. And they need to know this. Now, a lot of narcissists, of course, will not go to a psychologist because they don't want to hear these things. But I think self-awareness is one of the most important things, but not so that it's private.
Right.
It's got to be known to the spouse and to the people around him or her, that they know what this is about, that what your personality strengths and weaknesses are, and that you can be honest with one another about these issues. The second thing is we need to restore to the pastoral calling the centrality of character. Mm-hmm. You know, I think every pastor in the United States in the last 20 years has been exposed to Peter Drucker's famous statement that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that's his statement every morning. And I want to correct Peter Drucker, not that anybody would be listening to me in that world, but I would say that character eats culture for breakfast. So the culture is actually formed by character, not just by culture. But he's right. Culture is very significant. And I would say that we need to restore the significance of character in the pastoral calling, and in that process, degrade what I call platform performance persona. Mm-hmm. You know, I've been around some of these people, and they are some of these pastors and preachers. I've been around a lot of them, and they are really good. Mm-hmm. I mean, they can talk about anything. And I can't say that I've been around enough of them to know that they're a bunch of hypocrites. I don't experience pastors this way. I guess around me, that's not the way they are. But we have so valued the platform performance gifts, preaching, etc. And pastors on the platform exude a persona, because that's the way they present their ideas, that people think is the real person.
Right.
And they are responding to that persona. Mm-hmm. And that persona if it's not transparent and authentic, can be in for a devastating display of sickness if the person falls. And that's where we have not focused on character enough to say that the person of character needs to be on that platform more than just the person with gifts. I'm for good preaching. I teach this stuff.
Sure.
But I think we need to value the gift of character, of holiness, of love, of empathy, all these things of tove.
Okay, so if we know what anti-tove can look like in many different expressions, what are the key elements of a tove culture in a church?
Also, for those of our listeners that don't know Hebrew, can you define the word tove for us? We've been talking about this mysterious word. It might be
Insider
nice.
language.
You're just like our editors who said, what does tove mean? And no, we don't use Hebrew words in titles of books.
Not
And
yet.
I said, I want you to start using this in your office and see what happens. Tov is the Hebrew word for good. So God created everything tov in Genesis 1. And then when he was all done, he looked at it. It was tov ma'od, very good. And this word tov, good or goodness, is used in the Old Testament hundreds of times. It is a master moral category of the Bible. God is tov. Everything that God does is tov. His design is tov. He wants us to be tov. Jesus wants us to have tov works. And the Holy Spirit, one of the gifts, the fruits of the Holy Spirit is tov, or goodness. So tov is just all over the Bible if we're paying attention. And the gospel is what? Good news. And in Greek, the word is euangelizo, and EU is often a translation of the Hebrew word tov. So it's tov news. It's a message about tov. And the gospel is tov.
It is about how God is re-gooding the world through Jesus, right?
Re-gooding.
Re-gooding
the world. Now I don't know why you asked me that question, but you asked us what tov meant.
Key elements of a tove culture.
Okay. I'll tell you what Laura and I did. We mapped, and I think Laura helped with this a lot, the 7 characteristics of a toxic culture. The narcissism and power through fear. I worked on that, but Laura was big on institution, and we were both really death on the false narrative stuff. And Laura's the one who found all this stuff about loyalty and celebrity, and I've got a bone to pick about leadership as a primary category for what's going on. But pastors are leaders. And what we did is we flipped it. And I said, if this is the characteristic of toxicity, what is the opposite that would be tov? So it really was a temptation for me to go to the fruit of the Spirit. But there's so much written about that. I thought this is just not even appealing at the publishing level. We need something fresh. So I worked through the word of tov and goodness, and we flipped it, and we found 7 characteristics that flip the script. Empathy. Grace. Putting people first. Every one of these deserves an hour conversation. Telling the truth. Nurturing justice, which I define from the Hebrew word tzedek and the New Testament Greek word dikaiosune, as doing the right thing at the right time. And that right time is a very difficult thing to achieve. It often takes us time to perceive what the right thing is. And sometimes it's too late, sadly. And then so justice and nurturing service, and then the ultimate vision of it all, which is the same as tov, is nurturing Christ-likeness. So, I think we could do ourselves a world of good is to give our, let's say, budding pastors, say that you are working with in your church, people who you're bringing into your orbit, give them a test on how empathic they are. How much are you filled with grace and a grace agent? Do you put people first? Do you know people's names? Now, doesn't it irritate you when someone has worked with you or you know someone who's worked with someone else for a month and they can't remember their name. And I'm not talking about 70-year-old people who can't remember any names anyway. I'm just saying, you think, really, you didn't learn that person's name? What was this? Just a body that was an agent for you, that was fulfilling your will? Telling the truth.
Yeah.
You know, I'm really bothered about NDAs. I was one of the first people to start screaming bloody murder about this on my blog, and I consulted half a dozen churches, mega churches, about whether they do NDAs, and one of them told me, "Oh, we've never done one." And then a month later, he called me and said, "I had no idea. We've been doing them for several years, and they've shielded it from me." So this is a way of silencing people most of the time, and it protects it really shields the truth from being known. And nurturing justice, I mean, are we asking these questions? Do you tell the truth? Do you do the right thing at the right time? Are you involved in serving other people outside the context of the church? And how Christ-like are you? You know, those are penetrating questions.
Guys, I want to ask you a question about empathy here. I think a part of the book that really caught me and I was paying a lot of attention to as I was reading was just that element of empathy. Do we feel for people? And when I think when the soul is lost, our ability to connect with people, the whole game is lost. And I think we know that. But you cited a study that was incredibly alarming to me. You talked about this guy, Sukhvinder Obi, a neuroscientist at McMaster University in Ontario, who did a test where they use this transcranial magnetic stimulation machine. It just looks at what's going on in your mind. And they put the heads of the powerful and the not powerful under this machine. And what they discovered was that those who were in positions of power, what they found was that being in that position of power seemed to impair like a neural process, mirroring, we call it, that it seems to be like the cornerstone of empathy. In other words, your ability to really like clue in on like what is going on in other people and relate to that. And so you can't take one study and go, okay, this is now the new truth. But that is alarming. And I think that when you're in a position of power for very long, you learn that that's true, that there are just ways that the people that are underneath you, they want to please you, and you can become pretty calloused or insensitive to what's going on with them. So just as a leader, that was alarming to me, and I went, dear God in heaven. So then is leadership a losing proposition? You know, are you just consigned to becoming a less empathetic person because you're in this position? But I don't think that's what you're saying. But what I'd love for you just to unpack is how leaders can cultivate specifically the virtue of empathy in their own lives. How do we stop that from happening?
The most alarming thing to me about that study is how you've mentioned it already, just how power physically changes the brain.
That's right.
And the more that we have talked about this topic and heard stories from people, I don't know, it's easy for me to say because I'm in a different field. I'm working in education, but I don't know that God made people to have power. Mm-hmm. I don't know that human beings are meant to have it. That's how I feel.
Yeah. Well, we all have power at some level. Mm-hmm. And it's what we do with it. But
like if we have children, we have power over them. You know, how do we continue to maintain empathy?
I think one way to say it is unbridled and uncensored and power without restraint, power without control is always damaging to not only the person who has it, but to the person who receives it. And I'm watching the same thing, Laura, people with power that have really, the question I ask leaders is a very simple question is, do you have anyone in your life that can tell you no? And I'm shocked and stunned by the glazed over look that I get from powerful people that they really can't tell me anyone in their life that can tell them no. And all of the people that we've been talking about that we've watched wreck churches and ministries over the last 20 years found themselves in that vulnerable position where they had no one that could really tell them no. They were insulated and isolated from the real authority. So power without authority, power without boundaries, is extremely dangerous and never ends well, in my opinion.
And we've found that as we've talked around here about this, because Brady's been very open, like, let's not be that again. So, how do we make sure we get there? And he has taken to ask very specific questions of the people that work with him. The person who's sitting in the first chair has to invite very specific feedback. Because if not, hey, how was this weekend? Oh, it was great. Well, that's not a good question. Okay, let's talk about the elements of the service. When I said this, how did it come across? Was there anything that I said when I told this story? How did that play? Did that, so when Brady gets specific and invites feedback, or anyone in the first chair, and the people that are close to them have built trust, then you can begin to have actual true conversations. But the person in the first chair should know that they're always going to get everyone's best.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. That's Brady. I mean, I just applaud that you do this. The secret to it is how you respond when they, let's just say, as Chris has said to me, sometimes that wasn't a very good story. Why did you use that? That didn't make sense. Or, she said a couple times, you need to practice your introductions more. Those sorts of, how do you respond? It's difficult. These are very vulnerable moments. So, okay, now on empathy. The characteristic of all pastors, it's true that every pastor is on the scale of narcissism. There is no pastor who's not, because who else gets up in front of people, stands on a platform, performs sermons, and does so in charismatically acceptable ways, who isn't thinking about, influencing people? There is only narcissists. Only someone who is on the narcissistic scale, Chuck DeGroat says, will do this. So we need to be aware. What can we do to develop empathy? I think that we need the habit, especially leaders like this. They need the habit of being in touch with people in pain and to measure how they're responding to these situations. All right. They need to ask themselves, when they have had to make a difficult decision to fire someone, to release someone, how did they respond? Was it, okay, we'll find someone else? Or was it painful to do this sort of thing? I know a school administrator who could not handle an administrative load because it involved firing people. And this person had so much empathy for people, they could not find any reason to get rid of anybody, even when they should have. So they had empathy. And I find that people who are not in pain by other people's pains are the ones who need to become more aware of this. And if power is what changes the brain to a lack of mirroring, we need to practice the habit of losing power and having people over us who are more powerful than we are.
Well, sharing the pulpit is one practical way to get out of this, and not running from the spotlight and sharing the pulpit. Last night we had a prayer meeting at the church, and I was on the stage maybe 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes maybe. It may have seemed longer to those that were listening, but I think I was up there 6 or 7 minutes maybe. But the point is that we had an hour service, and you don't have to dominate. You don't have to be the front and centered person. And this is where I find this is the first telltale sign to me of young leaders who are not going to end well, is they just don't know how to share the spotlight. They crave it, they desire it, and they run toward it instead of running away from it and letting it catch them. And I just tell young, talented leaders all the time, don't crave it. It'll come to you. And when it comes to you, try to give it away.
Wow, that's good. Now, the other thing is to invite people on the platform who are better than you are, or who people say, man, I love it when so-and-so comes here. And if you feel the pain, like, do they think they're better than I am? That's really
a good
for
thing.
you.
That's
good
medicine for
thing.
the
That's a
soul.
good thing.
Yeah.
You know, I
Knocking
teach.
down the level.
I teach in academic studies, and let's face it, academics are pretty good at what they do, and they know a lot of things. I can't go anywhere down the hallway at my school without meeting someone who knows a lot more about something than I do. It's a pretty humiliating experience if your quest is to know everything. But if you can not only share what you know and what you have, but accept what other people have and know, you're going to be far better off. But Brady, I totally agree with you on sharing the pulpit. That limelight and glory and power and honor, it can create a real sense of the biblical sense and the English true sense of the word jealousy, where we don't want to lose our status. We're jealous for our status.
Scott, I tell young leaders all the time that you don't know if you have an appetite for humility until you have your first taste of success. But this is the telltale sign. The first taste of success will determine if you have an appetite for humility. And as a guy that's getting older, I'm determined to help these young guys develop an appetite for humility more than they have an appetite for success. And that's our only hope moving forward as a church.
Yeah, I like that. I like that.
That's an important ministry.
Very wise.
Well, guys, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. This was I think we could talk another hour. Maybe we can do that in the future. Thank you so much, first of all, for being obedient to writing a difficult book. This is not an easy book to write. I know it was costly. I can imagine in other conversations that we may have in the future, you could tell me how costly it has been for you to write such a book. I know it came at a great cost. So thank you for being obedient to write it. Thank you for being a prophetic voice to the church. Thank you for loving the church enough to write the book.